So today we are talking about the happiness series, and the premise, the theory is that more happiness is found when we have a balance of giving and receiving in these categories. And today we're going to talk about heart, giving and receiving heart. And we just spent 30 minutes discussing what we mean by heart, because heart can mean a lot of different things. It can mean emotions. It can mean like how we give and receive. You know, you hear about in couples, there's like a giver and there's a taker. Or are you a giver or are you a taker? So are you one of these people who's always doing for others, or are you not? And we are not really going to be talking about heart in that way. We're going to be talking about it a little bit in a different way. So talk to me about what it means to be bound to give and receive with your heart and the way you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it means, in my mind, my willingness to open up and expose the depths of what's going on with me. Sometimes that means the willingness that I have to expose myself to hard things, to pain, to uncomfortable things, whether it's uncomfortable things that someone else is going through, but also to my own hard things. And I think about this a little bit with the phrase that we use to describe some people when we say that they're heartless. You know, I think about, at least the way I'm framing this, and we could talk about this in so many different ways, but for the sake of this, I think of, when we describe someone as heartless, we think of them as having shut off their feelings. Shutting them off towards other people and shutting off their feelings towards themselves. And this giving and receiving that we're talking about is that both sides. It's the choice that we make to not shut off our feelings and our emotions and the depths of what's going on within us towards others and towards ourselves, both positive and negative. I mean, we know people who have a real clear ceiling on joy.
Yeah.
And we also know people who have a real clear floor on the pain before they'll just shut down in some form, whether it's just you can see it in their face, or whether they're changing the subject or they're leaving the room, whatever, they're not going to open up their heart. And my feeling, learned as one who is by nature very private and disciplined kind of with my feelings, is that if I do that to an extreme, I'm the one that loses out. That life is found when I am willing to open my heart to myself and to others carefully, not to everybody. And that's certainly where boundaries come in and things like that are very important and necessary. So I guess when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about opening up the depths of who we are to ourselves and appropriately to others, and allowing those others to open up the depths of who they are to us.
You know, when you're describing a person who's heartless, like you said, I'm even feeling compassion for someone like that, because nobody starts off life and says, I want to be a heartless person. Like, there's no such thing as a heartless child. And I think what happens, it's almost like we as human beings, to survive, sometimes have to create like an emotional tourniquet where we have experienced enough pain, or someone who's experienced enough pain, that in order to survive, they have to shut it down. It's
Right.
like they gotta suffocate the heart, suffocate the emotions in order to like physically make it. And it is like walking through life maimed though, because when we shut down the pain and we shut our hearts down to the pain, we shut our hearts down to so much of life. And opening our heart to the pain, in other words, giving and receiving, it's almost like we have to be willing to let our hearts receive and experience suffering and pain. And then when we do that, we're able to like give love and compassion to other people. And when we have shut our hearts to the pain, then we end up being heartless to other people.
Yeah, and I love what you said, and I agree wholeheartedly. It's just, I do feel a lot of compassion to those people who have perhaps just as a result of hard things have made the choice to kind of shut down their hearts. And I think it's a really sad thing. And, you know, in the end, opening our heart is the choice to risk and perhaps experience that our hearts are broken. And certainly our journey, you know, with Perrin had all of those elements you just said, you know, of, okay, are we going to open and expose and take the risks of hurting as much as all of that hurt? Or are we going to go into survival mode and shut down and put on the tourniquet to our heart? And what happens eventually if you put on a tourniquet is you lose the limb. You know, and I think the life-giving choice was not to close down our heart. And I think of this not just in the realm of opening ourselves to the really hard things, but I think of with Perrin, didn't mean to be talking about this when we talked about all of this beforehand, but it's certainly what comes to my mind. The experiences that stand out to me in just such a vivid way is the day that she was married 3.5 years into her cancer, and how there was never a more joyous day in my whole life that I experienced on that day that she was married. And then a year later, traveling with her and her husband, Joe, for a week to Ireland. We never knew up until the day that we left whether she would be able to make it on the trip. But it was the decision along the way to open our hearts and to risk and to have our hearts broken as they were that exposed the heights of what it means to live. And that's giving and receiving, and that's suffering, and that's feeling joy in the heights. And that is just so much of what life is about. So it's why I think that we could be masters of our money, and we could be masters of our talent and our time. But if we don't address the giving and the receiving and the opening of our heart in all these ways, life is black and white.
Well, I think we're wired to connect with each other, and we're wired to have this sharing of the heart, but it's hard to do. It's a vulnerable thing to do. But what I hear you saying when you talk about Perrin is that your capacity to experience joy was proportionate to your capacity to experience suffering. Like if you had shut down when she was going through this, shut your heart off, then you would have been shutting your heart off to joy. And I think that's a principle in life, really. I mean, many people have written about this, who've been through suffering, is that as your capacity to experience suffering increases, so does your capacity to experience joy. And it's almost like joy rushes in.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, it's like a balloon. When the balloon is being blown up of suffering, it is also inevitably being blown up with joy. It's like they're inextricably linked. I mean, I find this when I'm in some of the most significant suffering. Now, depression is a different thing. That's like a different, I'm not putting that in this, but I'm talking about like circumstantial suffering. I have laughed more in my life when I'm in circumstantial suffering.
You're so true, yeah.
I mean, it's just, it's like I don't know what it is. It's like we have this propensity to laugh and find joy when we're suffering. And when nothing is going wrong and everything seems to be going well circumstantially, I notice that my capacity for joy shrinks. And I start thinking, oh, you know, how can I manage life better? I start like, it's almost like my neuroses kind of go wild and my capacity to experience joy sometimes shrinks. So we're talking about opening our heart, having this generosity of giving and receiving our heart with suffering, and not overly so, not in an imbalanced way. We're not like masochistic way where we're like looking for suffering. But I heard you also talking about this giving and receiving in the way we relate to other people. And the word that comes to my mind there is an appropriate level of vulnerability.
Yes.
Of vulnerability. And it's almost like being willing to let someone see our hearts.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that there are not a lot of people in my life that I do this with, appropriately so. And I know that's the case for you as well. But just like that idea of the balloon of suffering and joy, it almost seems like to the extent that we can be open and vulnerable with our hearts with a few safe people, and they have to be the right people, it increases our capacity for love and connection. And really like human intimacy, not like in a physical sense, but just that joy-filled, rich relationships only come when there's a level of vulnerability.
Well, it increases our capacity to be loved.
Right.
You know, if we're shutting off, if we're only putting forward an image of who we really are, how much are we really loved by a person?
Right. So,
and this is where I think we get a little bit more into the practicality of life outside of the storm. Mm-hmm. You know, what was describing with the parent was life in the storm. But life outside of the storm, the day-to-day mundane life, I can think of many times, again, because I am by nature a very private person, in conversations with the few safe people, as you say, where I made a very uncomfortable decision to be vulnerable and to expose things I wasn't proud of or things that exposed my weakness. And it was hard. I felt even nervous about doing it, but it opened up the capacity to be truly accepted and therefore truly loved. And all of that created in me a range, a breadth of heart, as opposed to moving more and more towards carefulness and heartlessness, which any of us can do if we shut down our heart. So the practicality of this is that all of us have a few people in our lives, whether it's certainly a spouse, maybe our children. If you're not married, it's a few close friends that we have the constant choice about whether we're going to keep a wall up or not, or we're not going to do it. And one of the mechanisms that I've seen that people use very effectively is giving an unbalanced attention to the other person. That is, I think about it as I'm giving all the time and not receiving. So if, you and I go out and have coffee and I spend the entire time carefully and strategically asking you about everything going on in your life, it can easily be a means by which I'm making sure that you don't ask me something that causes me to have to expose what's going on. And some people are so prone, and they've even lost sense that this is what's going on. They're so prone to always give, to always ask about the other person, that they never open up to the things going on within themselves. And so that's the self-reflection, I guess, that I would want to encourage coming, out of this episode, is to see where you are perhaps in this sense of the giving and receiving to the breadth of our heart and what's going on. Because I think, as you said, it's what exposes the capacity for joy, or not.
Right. The connection. Yeah, I like your question about, who do you tend to fall into the asking questions, always focusing on the other person, or do you tend to focus on yourself and you may be overly transparent or overly sharing about yourself? I think that's a great question. And for me, I just think I really struggle with true vulnerability with anybody. I mean, even the people who are closest to me, to admit that I did something wrong, to admit that I'm feeling bad about myself in a certain area. And part of it is that it's hard to find the right friendships that you can do that with. And I think like a practical takeaway is even just like testing the waters in little ways about being vulnerable. It gives the other person permission to be vulnerable back. And let's be honest, our relationships are not this way right now. Like, very few of us have relationships like that. That's why Brene Brown's work on vulnerability has been so important.
Yeah.
And I think it's it's like learning a brand new hobby or a brand new sport. It's like we just have to start practicing in little ways with people that it's almost like you're trying out a relationship, a friendship that you have that is perhaps super surfacey and just like you have something in common, you have fun together, but we are wired to crave a little bit richer relationships. We are wired to crave these openness, that giving and receiving of our heart, not just our time, our fun, our personality, all of that. We are wired for that other level of a relationship. And it just takes that kind of first step. And then if the other person is able to respond with an openness, then you've got something to work with there. Yeah. And, it might not be for every friendship that you have. It might not be for every family relationship you have. But I do believe that everyone has in their life, because I'm a person of faith, that there are people right now in your life that are ready, they're relationships that are ready for this type of connection. And it just takes that stepping out and practicing in a little way to have that open heart relationship.
You're right. And I do think it's wise to test.
Yeah.
And test in small ways. Our hearts are very precious organs,
Sure.
and they can be scarred very easily if we're not, careful with that type of thing.
And I want to take back a little bit what I said when I said I'm a person of faith, and I think that everyone has access to people like this. I don't necessarily believe that's true right now, but I think if you're looking for it, you can start to find safe people.
Yes.
And the other concept that I think is super important is that if you don't have those kinds of relationships teed up and ready for this kind of openness in your life, there are structures in our society that are organized around being safe places for more in-depth conversation. I know that I host groups at my house that model this kind of conversation that's at a little bit deeper level. I think churches have this. I know recovery groups have this. And I think that even book clubs sometimes can have this a little bit more of an openness with their heart. And so I think if you don't have it with a friendship, you can look for a group that already has that structure in place.
Yeah, that's very true, although I'll have to say I think it's becoming more and more rare in our culture and is harder and harder to find. The reality, I think, is it will take some work.
Yeah.
It's not for a lot of us just sitting right there. And part of it is because more and more people have closed down their hearts.
Yeah.
And sometimes that closing down our hearts is not necessarily kind of that intentional choice. Sometimes it's a factor of we have become massively distracted people. Mm-hmm. And that distraction has had the effect of closing down our hearts. Mm-hmm. So you think in our last episode when we were talking about looking and lingering, how rare that is and how we can be with people and be in even settings that have that possibility and we're still stuck on our phones or we're still looking in other directions or, all of these different practices. So I think another practical takeaway is that we have to grow our own disciplines of focused, undivided attention to the person sitting right in front of us. And that's hard. But how good would it be if we said, okay, I got this far to go in that. I'm not a person worthy of someone opening up their heart to because I don't give them the attention. So I need to become that person first. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of it. It's where all of this giving and receiving as a path to happiness all mixes together because we have to be people who have chosen to linger. Mm-hmm. We have to be people who look the person in the eye, even when it's a little bit uncomfortable. We have to be people who would be willing for someone to cry, with us, or be willing to listen to their greatest success, and these are skills we need to.
I find that I'm just going to be honest. I struggle with knowing the right balance for this. Like I'm a female, obviously, so I do think that female relationships are a little bit safer space for this. I think it's a little bit harder for certain guys, not all guys, and certain women, not all women. But sometimes I don't want to be a downer, like knowing what's the difference between transparency and being a little bit open with your heart or being a downer with someone. I don't know. I think it's a tricky thing. And I appreciate what you said about all of life is practice.
Yeah.
Because I think when we're learning to have more open relationships and richer relationships, I think we're going to get it wrong.
That's just, thank you for saying it, because I think it's really true. And what I would like to think about is what is the trajectory we're going on in this area. So, one of the things that I've done for myself and I've done with people that I coach is go through a practice that I call creating your future life vision. Mm-hmm. And it's envisioning the person that you would like to be 20 years down the road looking back. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was apparent for me when I did that, when it came to relationships, is I wanted to become a person that was more open and more vulnerable and experience more intimacy in relationships. And I did that in that future life vision because I realized that's not who I am. Naturally, it's not who I am now, but that's the person I want to grow into 20 years from now. So this is hard. It's so imperfect, and we're only going to be making baby steps by practicing and taking little risks and probably being hurt, along the way. But we'll realize, as I do, thinking back, on our years with Perrin, that it was some of those choices that opened us up to the greatest joys that I'll ever experience as a person in the absolute midst of the greatest pain.
Well, and it's super hard because I think we care about friendships and we care about being liked. And so we don't want to do anything to upset a friendship. And it takes some bravery. Like, I'm just thinking about, I had a friend who was a close friend who essentially just kind of stopped calling me. I mean, we had changed places in life and we sort of moved apart. That stuff happens. But I need to think about that and reflect on that and learn from it, because sometimes we will try and be open with people and it just doesn't work. It's not a great fit.
Yep.
But in response to that kind of quote unquote rejection or quote unquote just it didn't work, we can pull back, be like the turtle, go into the shell, be guarded, put on the emotional tourniquet. But I really like what you're saying about, again, all of life is practice, is if we cannot cut off in response to like friendships that haven't worked or people that don't call us back or feeling left out when we see something on Instagram. Like it's really hard not to like retreat when we're hurt socially or hurt in friendships. But if we can somehow remain open and learn from the pain and see what was that teaching me, I think that helps us have this giving and receiving heart instead of this culture that we get of just really only putting forth this mask or our best self.
Yeah, and so I think I'd say, because this is a very different kind of episode in terms of the things we're talking about, my encouragement would be perhaps for people to spend a little bit of time reflecting on what they're doing with their heart and what they're doing in their relationships. And is there a place a small place to move, to practice that might move towards the possibility of this rhythm of giving and receiving, and towards a possibility of more joy and happiness in our life? So I feel like it's critical. That's what we're here for. So
that's great. And I think I'm such a visual person. So in my mind, what I'm going to take away is this idea of balloons. Like if you want to open yourself up to joy in your life, it's the same balloon as suffering. And sort of we have to open our heart to all of the suffering and pain that life brings us and the joy that comes with it. And also if you're wanting to have richer relationships in your life, part of that is opening yourself up, increasing your capacity for vulnerability. So those are great thoughts on having giving and receiving with our hearts. So thanks.
Thanks.